It would certainly depend. I mean, there are certain artworks that I suppose are designed to affect your own life. Maybe a feminist film that shows ways in which male behavior may be unfair or unjust. I mean, it may cause you to reflect upon yourself, and if it's does that in a way that seems like it's not idiosyncratic to you, but has a consciousness raising effect that's fairly general, then I think it may have a legitimate role to play in appreciating the work. How effective is it as addressing one or a certain audience's life as a kind of corrective? But on the other hand, an awful lot of the other things. I mean, for example, if you see a film and you say, gee, I really like that leather jacket. I think I'm going to go out and buy one. I think that would be irrelevant to your appreciation of the film. It more or less depends on what the aim of the work is. Of course, if it's an advertisement for a clothing store, and it makes people want to buy the jacket, then it's successful as an advertisement, although probably not as a major work of art. I always wonder, nowadays you go to the movie theater and there are these ads that you don't really understand what they're about until the very last scene in the ad, and they're about. They turn out that this was a car advertisement, or this was a Levi's advertisement. They're kind of clever, but I never know what to make of them. Also, I'm certain that nobody goes out of a movie theater after seeing a car advertisement and says, "I think I'm going to buy an SUV." I don't understand those at all. They seem to me that they're supposed to be about selling cars, but they are designed to affect you in a way that will not make you buy a car, especially if it's like a $40,000 car. Doesn't that happen to you? You just don't know what this is an ad for. There's a Levi ad. There's a Levi ad where you see all kinds of different people, different ages, different cultures. They're all dancing, and it's not until the end that you get a close-up of someone's behind where it says Levi. Well, I think that certainly to be a critic, that you should have knowledge of the art form that you're working in. You need it to know about the aims of different kinds of works in that form. And I also think if you're just let's call you a civilian, that your ability to appreciate art will be enhanced the more you know about the art form that you're dealing with. I think it's highly unlikely, although this is a matter of controversy, that you can just be an art critic as such. I mean, that the person who is a very good critic with respect to, let's say, poetry would also automatically be a good critic of architecture. Now, I'm not saying that people can't be adept at more than one art, but I'm not very confident that someone could be a universal critic, because I do think that it requires knowledge of different art forms. There's a story that when Ravi Shankar, the sitar musician, became very popular because the Beatles were very interested in him, he was invited to play in London, and his first performance in London, he sat on the stage and he was tuning his sitar, and when he stopped tuning it, everyone applauded. And he said, well, I think you're going to like the performance tonight if you like my tuning the guitar, my sitar, as much as that. So, I mean, you have to know something about what you're listening to be a music critic. You know, and you know, there are lots of examples of this. Somebody who is trained in Gregorian chant and knows about Gregorian chant, well, that person might not have the kind of background knowledge you need to be a good critic of hip-hop. So I think actually appreciation is always enhanced by knowledge of the art form that you're talking about, and that makes me skeptical of the likelihood of somebody who's just an art critic with a capital A. In other words, the mistress or the mistress of all arts. Oh, you also asked if you have to be an artist to be a critic. I don't think it hurts to have some training in the art form. I mean, I had some training. I made some films before I was a film critic, and it certainly helped me. By the way, I was not a good filmmaker, but I did make some films. So I think it's not a bad idea if you're a music critic to be able to have at least some background in some musical instrument. I don't think it's absolutely necessary, but I think it is a good thing. On the other hand, I do think that there is a distinction between the artist and the critic. They do different things. We shouldn't expect the artist to be able to analyze her work and give you the kind of analyses that a critic does. After all, as some artists would say to you, well, why do I have to explain it to you? I already did it. And I think that's fair enough. That is actually what their job is, and it's the critic's job to analyze it. On the other hand, I wouldn't want to go too far and say, that's such a distinction that an artist couldn't be an art critic. Some can be very good critics. The sculptor Donald Judd was a good critic and a good artist. George Bernard Shaw was a good critic and a good artist. So some people can play both roles. I don't think it's necessary for a critic to be able to perform both roles, or for an artist to be able to perform both roles. In fact, sometimes when critics try to be artists, they bungle it, and we all know artists who, when they attempt to be critics, are kind of bullshitters. Well, there are two questions there. The first is how do you determine the purpose? Well, there are a number of ways and a number of avenues you have to determine purpose. None of them are absolutely conclusive, but each of them give you evidence. If a work belongs to a certain genre or art form, that gives you some idea of what the purpose is likely to be. If the work of art is part of a movement or a style, that gives you ideas. The time and period in which the artwork is made gives you ideas about purpose. And there is lots of evidence about the purpose of the work in terms of the discernibility of the intention of the artist. I mean, first of all, the work itself is evidence of what the purpose and the intention are. And then, you know, there are things like diaries, if it's a painting, drawings that were done in preparation for it, interviews, manifestos, information from the artist's friends and relatives and contemporaries. All these things can be marshaled to give you ideas of what the purposes of the work are. There's nothing really mysterious about it. After all, forget about art. Think about the political purposes of historical figures. Historians gather all kinds of evidence about what people intended to do, what their purposes were, on the basis of all kinds of different streams of evidence. And it's the same, I would argue, with determining the purpose of the artwork. Now, it's not something that you can be or claim to be indubitable. It's not a matter that you can have absolute certainty in. But that makes talking about the purpose of the artwork no worse than talking about most other human purposes. And as for how you go about evaluating things without the idea of taste, we evaluate things all the time in terms of whether or not they serve their purposes. That's just a way of determining whether something is good, whether an artifact is serving its purposes. So that's how you go about determining that. So you know, for example, if the purpose of a novel is to instill, excite anticipation, expectation about what's happening, well, then you can evaluate it in terms of whether or not it's suspenseful and why it's suspenseful. Suppose you look at something that's being sold or presented as a mystery story. Suppose in the first chapter you think the butler did it, and then in the second chapter you think the butler did it. In the third chapter you think the butler did it. And then at the very end the detective says the butler did it. Well, that really didn't instill very much curiosity. So if you attributed to the purpose of the work that it was supposed to instill curiosity, as mysteries are supposed to do, then you would say, this is really not a very good example. This is a bad mystery because it doesn't realize its purpose. Now, some people might say, well, that doesn't make evaluating art sound that different from evaluating other things. And I agree with that. I think that's right. But I think that's actually an advantage of this approach. We shouldn't make appreciating art a mystery. We shouldn't make it sound like it's something occult. It's actually very much to the advantage to kind of demystify it and say, well, it is like thinking about what make other things good. And by the way, I think that also would bolster and be an advantage in art education, so that we wouldn't treat artworks as things that have to put you in this kind of special state that you're only ever in when you experience artworks. I think that's a way of of mystifying the process, whereas this approach to appreciation and evaluation makes it very familiar in a good way. I suppose some people think that it's an elitist approach because it discounts certain reactions. I mean, one thing that you might think is a more democratic view is represented by the old saying, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. And some people might think, well, if you discount people's liking in this way, that's elitist. Isn't everybody entitled to what they like? And I'm happy to say people are entitled to what they like, but if they want to appreciate it, they actually should know something about it. Is that elitist? I don't know. Is it elitist if I say, well, I don't know much about baseball, but I know what I like, and I don't like baseball, right? I think there's nothing elitist about saying, well, maybe before you decide that baseball is uninteresting, you ought to learn something like the rules of the game. Maybe you should learn something about the history of the game. It's not just a bunch of people, you know, running around willy-nilly on the field, and you know, a matter of whether you like the color of their uniforms and you know how they run around the bases. You know, requiring that you know something about something in order to appreciate it doesn't seem to me elitist. Yes, maybe people are entitled to their own opinion if what that means is what they like, but not everyone understands things equally, and understanding very often requires knowing something, having a certain kind of background. Is it elitist to say people should have some background and some knowledge about what they're making judgments about? It doesn't seem to me that's elitist. It just seems to me that, after all, I'm not saying there's just one group of people here who have to have a background knowledge to have understanding. I'm willing to say that about everything. I mean, to appreciate a checker game, you have to know about checkers. Likewise, to appreciate abstract expressionism, you have to know something about art. Is this requirement that you need some background knowledge to understand things elitist? I don't think so, in the sense that it applies to everything. Well, there are different ways in which you might not be able to determine the purpose of the artwork. One is that it's just very confused, and if it's so confused that it's not clear what it's doing, that would count against it. Now, you have to be careful, though. Sometimes you have to ask yourself, is it that the artwork doesn't have a purpose, or is it confused, or is it because I'm confused? So you do have to try, when you don't understand an artwork, or when it looks like it's going awry, you have to ask yourself, why might someone make it something like this? You have to give it the benefit of the doubt. Now, the kind of work that is often described as not having a purpose is described as not having a constituent purpose by the artist, is the artwork that the artist wants to say has a kind of open structure. The artist wants to give the spectator the opportunity to explore the work and to construct it in any way that he or she seems fit. Those kind of artworks, like surrealist artworks, do have a purpose. They have a purpose of making the space open to the spectator to explore it. So, for example, in the dances of Merce Cunningham and John Cage, they use various kinds of strategies, including composing the work by casting the runes of the I Ching. They use strategies like that to try and destructure the work, make it look random. But that shows that they actually have a purpose, trying to make the work open as an invitation to the audience to make what they will of the work. Or in film, an example would be Andalusian Dog by Dali and Buñuel. They tried to make a film where all of the different sections gave the appearance of being disconnected from each other in order to allow the audience to kind of associate how they would, to make an open structure so that the audiences could not be forced into discovering a single meaning to the work. But to do that, they had to find the appropriate form. They had to, for example, wherever they thought meaning was accumulating, to break it and edit in a different way. So the works that artists claim don't have a purpose because they've been made for the audience to actually roam freely in it, are in fact driven by a purpose, just as I suppose if you designing a space for free-range chickens to roam in, you have to set your fences up in a certain way. You have to give them enough room to explore. Similarly, artists who say that their work really doesn't have a purpose, they're giving a gift to the audience to do what they will with it, those works have to be structured in such a way to afford that kind of freedom. You could do it inadvertently. That is to say, you create a work of art that has no discernible purpose. Why? Well, because you botched it, and no one can understand why it's structured this way. Or you can be trying to make a kind of theoretical point, maybe challenging the idea that an artwork had no purpose, but then it would have a meta purpose, which would be to construct it in a way that it has no discernible purpose. Well, one way you might do that that's very a recurring feature of 20th century art and now continuing is to adopt what's called an aleatoric strategy, a chance strategy. So Tristan Tzar, the Dadaist, would clip words out of a newspaper and then throw them in a top hat, and then withdraw them from the top hat and put them next to each other as his poem. Now, that actually is a strategy that decouples his intention from the words in the poem, right? Because he didn't, it was all a matter of chance what words got picked out. So there you have a device, a strategy that is meant to decouple the intention from the potential meaning. But notice that that's a very specific intentional strategy to make or decouple the meaning of the words in the sentences. But as an artistic work itself, that has an intention, namely to decouple meaning So the work itself has a purpose, which is to decouple the meaning of the poem from the artist's intention. So it's only at the level of the meaning of the words that the intentions are inoperable. As an artwork itself, it has been designed, a specific strategy has been used to achieve the purpose, to decouple the meaning from the intention. And an appropriate strategy has been adopted, namely the use of chance operations. As I pointed out, in terms of the approach that I'm advocating, there are two elements. There's the constitutive purpose of the work on the one hand, and there's the way it's been elaborated or articulated or embodied on the other hand. And each of those involves a different kind of evaluation. One kind of evaluation is how well do the choices the artist has made suit the purpose. So that's one level of evaluation. But then we can also evaluate the purpose. We can ask a couple of questions about the purpose. First, we can ask, was the purpose one that was worthy? So if you wrote a 25,000 page saga for the purpose of having more semicolons in it than any fantasy fiction ever had, it's not really clear that purpose was worth pursuing in the first place. So you might say, well, it used appropriate means to do that, but was that really worth doing? The other thing is, the purposes actually can be worth something, but they can be of better and lesser importance. So you can make a film. Let's say you make a Tom and Jerry cartoon, right? And it's perfect. It suits its purposes absolutely exquisitely, or a Popeye cartoon, say, and so it suits its purposes. But its purpose is less important than Grand Illusion by Renoir, say. The purpose is of Grand Illusion, and its insights into, for example, the illusion. Well, what is Grand Illusion's purpose? Well, one purpose is to make the point that, on the one hand, you think that boundaries between countries are illusions. You can't see them. But what's the grand illusion? To think that the difference between countries are illusions. Because people die. They get killed for being on the wrong side of a border. So there, a very profound point is made, and it's made through very astute artistic choices. For example, showing you at the end of the film that you can't see the boundary between Switzerland and Germany. So very appropriate visual means are used to suggest that the difference between these countries are illusions. But the Germans are there with their rifles, and they're about to shoot the escapees. And then the one German says, no, they've just crossed the country. They've just crossed the border. They're on the right side of the border. We can't shoot them. They're in Switzerland, right? So there it's shown, well, it was a matter of life and death, even if you couldn't see it. Even if you thought it was an illusion, it was an illusion because it was a matter of life and death. So on the one hand, that film chooses exquisite visual means to make its point. But its point is really profound. Whereas the Popeye cartoon, Eat Your Spinach, may perfectly realize its purpose, but its purpose is much less. So that would be a case where we would have what you were describing. two films that actually articulate their purposes perfectly, but because of the difference in purpose, one is much greater than the other. Well, in one sense, I don't think that there is that much of a difference, and I think that's good. Art appreciation is a form of artifact appreciation, and things that are artifacts almost always have purposes, and it's almost always appropriate to appreciate them in terms of whether or not they perform their purposes. Although artifact appreciation and art appreciation is different from nature appreciation. Why? Well, because nature, unless you're a certain kind of theist, doesn't really have a purpose. So there is a difference between nature appreciation and art appreciation, even though in the earlier 18th century approaches, art appreciation and nature appreciation were treated as pretty much the same. Why? Because what you appreciated in both cases was beauty, and beauty was something you detected in terms of taste by sensing the pleasure it gave. So the difference between things that are man-made and things that are just part of the furniture of the world marks a difference that the form of art appreciation I'm advocating tries to track. So nature appreciation and art appreciation and artifact appreciation don't belong to the same boat. They're two different boats. Well, I really can't say, because I mean I know about the photograph, but I haven't seen any of the reproductions. It's hard to say for the following reasons. You know, sometimes the photograph can be more powerful than the drawing or the painting, but it can also go in the other direction. I know that some people would be very dogmatic and say, well, the photograph is always going to be more real. Why? Because of the relationship of the photograph and what photography is to the real event. Now, you know, first of all, nowadays that faith in that relationship has been compromised, because with digital photography, it's not really clear that the relationship is as people presuppose the old celluloid relationship is, and I'm just not convinced that every photograph is going to be more gripping than, let's say, a human-made or a handmade drawing or representation. After all, when you move to the handmade media, you have the possibility of making certain features salient in a way that might be more gripping than the comparable photograph. Then there are kind of other issues that we found recently, for example, with Dana Schutz's drawing of the photograph of Emmett Till in his casket, where, of course, a lot of problems were raised about the drawing being an appropriation of the photograph that a white artist was not entitled to. But of course that raises other issues and a whole other set of debates about who has the right to represent what.